Okay, folks, we are on to filling the frame. So this one might seem rather self-explanatory. Hopefully it stays that way as I go through this. So filling the frame focuses on minimizing the amount of dead space in a photograph. So this is making sure that your space is active and engaging rather than just being plain and boring. So to do that, you'll need to get close to your subject. You'll need to walk over to it. You'll also need possibly to zoom in. I know that getting tight shots of your subject might be uncomfortable, but it's much more interesting. So you can also crop, but you'll lose clarity. Digital pictures are made up of these teeny tiny little cells called pixels. And when you crop, you're still keeping the same amount of information, but making it go farther. So it loses clarity in the details because those single pixels have to stretch to fill up the same amount of space to tell you the same image. So to give you an example of what happens when you crop, but also how it affects the scene, we have this lovely little daisy, and you might be sitting there thinking, oh, but Miss Tran, you put it directly in the center, then you would be right. We'll talk more about that later. But I just want you to take a look at this for a second and see how much space there is around it. There's a lot of green, there's a lot of leaves, there's a lot of not really anything other than the flower. So if we crop it and get even closer to it, more of the focus is on that center of the flower, is on those petals. And we don't spend as much time on the useless area around it in the greens. Alternatively, here's a cute little picture of me and my grandma, but look at the space above our heads. There is so much dead space that just doesn't need to be included in there. So while this is a really nice, intimate picture of us, if we crop it and make sure that we fill the frame with just our faces, it becomes a lot softer and more meaningful, in part because we take up so much more of the frame. We're able to spend our time looking at us rather than the space around us. So the other half of that is zoom. Now, cameras have multiple different types of zoom. There's digital zoom versus optical zoom. Optical zoom being where the camera itself can change the modifications based on the lenses. So it can look further and further away and get further and further in focus. But not every camera has that. And I don't believe our iPads have that. They just have what is called digital zoom, which is basically like cropping. So because our cameras only have limited range of focus, digital zoom can be a really good way for you to fill the frame with what's important, but if your camera doesn't have the pixel capacity to back it up, it can make your picture a little bit grainier. Do it if you need to, but otherwise you should always work to get as close as possible. The other problem with zoom is that you need to make sure that you hold your camera very steady. Either use a tripod or set it down on something if you can. When you think about it, when we hold our cameras out, we want to make sure that it's nice and close so that we're not shaking and moving and, losing what we're doing, okay? So when you zoom, smaller motions have bigger effects. So when you're using zoom, you want to make sure that your camera is as steady as possible so that you don't get those wiggles and vibrations messing up your picture. Additionally, when you use further magnification, it can create blurry pictures, especially if you're in low light, when your camera might be using a slower shutter speed. Do you remember what setting you could change to make that less apparent? I hope you said ISO, because that's something that can help, but it still might make it blurry, because if you remember, higher ISO speeds make for a grainier picture. Now, something that some cameras can allow you to do is to shoot your picture and zoom at the same time. So if you think of videos where they're like warping through hyperspace or moving at hyperspeed, oftentimes that's using a camera that can zoom and take a picture at the same time. So you get this kind of rushing effect next to the subject. Now, I don't think our cameras have that possibility, but you're always welcome to try. So here's an example of my kitty cat Yuzu, and the first picture is me just leaning over and taking a picture of her laying on the bed. The second picture, which is the first one on the right side, is using zoom. It's the same view, same cat, sitting there, taking the picture. And then the third one, that one in the lower right, is what happens when I cropped it. So the cat picture was one size, and then to make sure that I only got her eyes, her face, I cropped everything else out of the picture, but it made the picture lose a lot of clarity. So even though it's the same size, because it's been cropped and those pixels have been forced to stretch to fill up that space, it loses some of its focus. So, move closer, zoom if you have to, crop if it's absolutely necessary, but overall, fill your frame. Use that space to your advantage. Next up, we'll be talking about the horizon line.